Policy Matters. Policy Matters is a conversation platform which aims to provide reasoned analysis and content to the activities, reforms and policies of the federal government of Ethiopia.
Mustafe, Muhammad, thank you so much for making time for this important interview, and thank you so much for joining us here today. A few days back, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed has been talking about so many stories of atrocities, crimes, heart-aching stories crimes committed by TPLF, and over the 27 years of their leadership, how things were really damaging for people who are citizens of this country. Now, let's just begin by talking about what do you really make of these atrocities, crimes committed by TPLF, and what do you really think was the reason behind?
Yeah, thank you, Guru. To start with the address of the Prime Minister to the Parliament, I think the Prime Minister articulated what the TPLF has been doing when it was in power, what it was doing when it was about to lose power, on the wake of the revolt against it, mainly in Amhara and in Oromia and Amhara regions, and what it was trying to do even after it lost power, how it was trying to undermine and subvert the reform agenda. I think the Prime Minister gave a very damning account of the criminality and vulgarity of the TPLF leadership. I believe... Let
me add some points to help you perhaps explain it to us. He was talking about mass graves and mass tortures, mass murders, chasing people away from this country because of their different views and others. Please explain.
Yeah, well, I think that has been discussed by human rights organizations, by the international media, by dissident members of the Ethiopian community for a long time. What the Prime Minister has added was a personal recollection from a close-up position, how the system was alienating all with different ideas, how ideas were criminalized, the extent to which the TPLF was willing to go to remain in power, and the fact that there seemed no red lines for it. If communities have to kill each other, the TPLF was okay. If the entire country plunges into civil war and chaos, the TPLF leadership seemed okay as long as they were in power, or as long as their interests were not endangered. So what was really revealing about the TPLF was when he talked about how in the early days of the reform, he himself was surviving. I mean, here is a Prime Minister who was brought to power by his party. The rules were clear. But I think in detail, the Prime Minister talked about the risks to even his life and his family's life in those days. Now, if the TPLF group could put a Prime Minister of a country to that level of danger, you can imagine what they can do to the ordinary Ethiopians. And therefore, I think most of the parliament members, most of the public were really amazed by the level of detail the Prime Minister shared on the criminality of the TPLF. But the accounts of human rights violations were there even before the Prime Minister talked to the Parliament. I mean, Ethiopians know that in the 27 years reign of TPLF, human rights violations were common. Political opponents were killed or imprisoned.
Let me give you some more examples on this, so we can also elaborate it further. When you talk about human rights violation and even interference into people's affairs, Ethiopians lived together for centuries with harmony and love. People of Oromo and Somali, for instance. But Prime Minister was talking about how the very intelligence organization formed to protect citizens has been working against its notions or even its mandate, fabricating stories to start commotions and even printing flags to start fightings amongst people. The regional fighting between Ethio-Somali and the Oromia regional state people, how do you really explain the orchestration here?
Yeah, I think what the Prime Minister said regarding the intelligence arm of the TPLF was what they have been doing in the last days when they felt that the anger of the Ethiopian people is turning against them. But I believe the behavior they showed in the last days was also what they started with. If you remember the transitional period right after the EPRDF took power in 1991, there were a lot of crimes committed in different parts of the country, which are almost the same as the ones that were committed in the just before the reform that brought Prime Minister Abiy to power. So, because not many Ethiopians knew about the behavior of the TPLF and its intelligence and how it works, several crimes that have been committed, even in those early days, massacres in parts of Oromia, which were blamed, which OLF was blamed to have done. I mean, what happened, what we have seen in the last days of TPLF makes you wonder whether what was happening also in the early days was not the same orchestration of the TPLF and its intelligence wing. Very callous, very hateful, and the TPLF seemed to have premised its existence on division and hostility among different ethnic groups, but particularly between Amharas and Oromos. And therefore, I think it's not surprising that in the last days, when their power was threatened, they went to the extent of printing OLF flags, printing the flags that they think the Amharas represent Amharas, and to fuel an inter-ethnic mayhem and destruction in the country. A number of high-profile assassinations were also done in the last couple of years. Not only that, in all regions, you can say some sort of violence has been sponsored, mainly in Oromia, in Somali region, Benishangul and all. And therefore, when you look at what the TPLF was doing, for instance, you have mentioned the Somali-Oromo conflict.
Yeah.
That's
particularly interesting.
An attempt to outflank.
Yeah.
To outflank the reformists.
I just wanted to make a point here, but that was particularly interesting because the story was used against the people themselves when it was not supposed to be used. Ethiopians and Ethio-Somalis and Oromos were living together, intermarried for a long time with almost no problems. But then again, unconstitutionally, they have been agitated to start war. Why was that happening, really?
That was part of the overall TPLF game of surviving by unleashing inter-ethnic conflicts in different parts of the country. They felt that will stop the reformists from coming to power. And when they failed, they also continued that because their ultimate game was to plunge most of the country in violence, give the impression that Tigray is well governed and is therefore peaceful because nobody is sponsoring violence there, and to use that as a sign of the fact that the 27 years rule was better than what the reform promised. And I believe to some extent some gullible international media have bought that. That have been seen in the days of the law operation against TPLF in the last 1 month or so. You could see how some international media were reporting the situation as if the TPLF was so powerful to withstand the federal government, as if the law enforcement operation would put the country into a sort of civil war. So that comes from what TPLF has been doing, both propaganda-wise, but also through creating unrest in different parts of Ethiopia and blaming the reformist team for the breakdown of rule and law. So you know, society and people above anything value order and rule of law. So by undermining the rule of law, by undermining law and order in different parts of the country, the TPLF wanted to get the view, to pass the view that without it, Ethiopia is ungovernable. And I think the Prime Minister is briefing to the Parliament were mainly along the attempts made by the TPLF at different times to present itself as the only group that can ensure the continuity of Ethiopia as a country.
Just to remind you, the Prime Minister here said, alongside your point, he said the idea was to present the reformist government, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government, as a weak government, so that, as you've said, arrests and others can be engulfed across the country. Now, in this regard, I just want you to answer this question for me. How do you think the international community should view this situation, the TPLF situation of handling things in this country in their 27 years of administration, and even the law enforcement mission, the humanitarian situation handling of the government, because there are so many misunderstandings going on, sometimes knowingly, you know?
Yeah. Well, coming from the Somali region, where for nearly 10 years, the TPLF was committing something close to ethnic cleansing, and knowing the silence of the international community, I was left to wonder what considerations are there for the international communities when it comes to passing moral judgments and political positions on countries. If the international community was not outraged with what the TPLF was doing against Ethiopian people, not only Somali region, in Oromia, in Amhara, thousands of detentions, tens of thousands of disappearances, massive displacement of communities from their land, jailing of political opponents, torture, widespread torture in the country. If this all were not agitating the international community during the TPLF era, why were they seemed agitated when the Ethiopian people and government took matters into their hand and dealt with the TPLF, with the criminal junta, whose track record in human rights is very, very suspect. So that element of looking back at the history and track record of TPLF on human rights and governance was missing from the international narrative that permeated the media after the law enforcement operation was commenced by the federal government. So you wonder what other considerations are there. Does some of the international media really have the interests of Ethiopians at heart, or are there other reasons that we don't know? And therefore, I think humanitarian considerations are valid, but the primary responsibility of protecting Ethiopians lies with the federal government of Ethiopia. And therefore, I don't believe the outcries that were made when the law enforcement operation started have to do with the protection of human rights, because if that was the case, human rights was violated systematically for 27 years, and we haven't seen such outrage. That is not to say that, because human rights were violated for 27 years, the international community must keep silent if violations continue today. What I'm saying is, first of all, we don't have evidence of systematic violence right now. The international community, therefore, should have looked at things. I'm not talking about all international community. I'm talking about international media and some members of the international community who seemed to absolve the TPLF from the criminal track record it has on human rights. So when we talk about TPLF, we should be talking about, to me personally, I can draw a parallel between TPLF behavior and what was witnessed in 1970s Cambodia with the violent Khmer Rouge team.
By the way, you remind me of some international diplomats' opinion in this regard. The 27 years of atrocities committed, the crimes, according to the Prime Minister's even personal account, of most probably holding him hostage in his own palace, and others, including the conflict situations that we've been talking about, the killings and the mass arrests and the mass graves. They've been saying that the International Criminal Court should start looking at this matter. If you remember in Cote d'Ivoire, when Laurent Gbagbo was removed from power, the ICC intervened. In so many other places in DRC, same situations have been repeated. Do you believe this case can qualify for the ICC to look into?
I think the Maikadra massacre alone will warrant holding the TPLF leadership as international terrorists, leave alone the 27 years of killings and humiliation of and dehumanizing of the Ethiopian people. The single act of Maikadra, where hundreds and hundreds of civilians were killed just because of their ethnicity by a youth group of the TPLF, is a good enough reason to take the TPLF leadership to the International Criminal Court. Now, I think covering the human rights aspect, the Prime Minister was very comprehensive in outlining what was happening in Somali region, what the TPLF did, first against the Somalis, then by instigating a border conflict between Somalis and Oromos, and then finally by unleashing attack on non-Somalis in Jijiga on August 4, where a lot of atrocities were committed against non-Somalis in Jijiga. All of these were attempts to undermine the reform agenda, and so that people can remain in power through violence, as it has done in the last 27 years. But I would like also to look at something that the Prime Minister mentioned in his briefing to the Parliament, which was about the extent, the shocking extent of state capture by the TPLF. And I think some of the grievances that the Ethiopian public expresses has to do with the political culture that the TPLF left behind, that will continue to affect the psyche of our political system for a long period of time, regarding the state capture in military, in federal bureaucracy, and even at the regions, where nominally regions were supposed to be to have self-autonomy, but in reality, regions were nothing more than a playground for TPLF interests. So I'm trying to also bring that dimension of state capture, which the TPLF used to justify its violence, because the attraction of power to TPLF was state capture, embezzling the resource of the country, grabbing land everywhere. For instance, I can give you an example of in Somali region where TPLF generals looted over 100,000 hectares of land, which we recently recovered from them. So the history of TPLF, the behavior of TPLF is one of extreme state capture, extreme violation of human rights, ethnocracy at the center, mono-ethnocracy, I would say, by one group domination, and hate against the others. And therefore, I think the Prime Minister's briefing to the Parliament showed where Ethiopia was before the reform. And for anyone who listens to that and who gets the details of the extent of the abuses that the TPLF was meeting against other ethnic groups in this country, I think the rationale of the law enforcement operation against TPLF will become very clear. More so when you also take the Tigrayan people also into consideration, because the assumption has always been that the TPLF was representing Tigrayan interest. Unfortunately, the most abused people turned out to be Tigrayans, because all of the democratic and human rights that were denied, that the other Ethiopians were denied, were also denied in Tigray. And all of the bad governance and extreme torture and control of political space was also implemented in Tigray.
The Prime Minister was also talking about this particular matter of people of Tigray, how they've been suffering under TPLF's rule, even from the infrastructure development to some of the luxury of democracy, say multi-party system and the others. And this is really unconstitutional, another crime to be mentioned. Mustafe, we have to come to our conclusion of this very important interview, but I want you to take us through very shortly into the efforts being done by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's administration, which you are also part of, in righting the wrong over the last perhaps 3 years.
Yeah. Before I move to that, allow me briefly to talk about what the Prime Minister and the reform team has been doing even after TPLF lost power and influence at the center. As you know, the Prime Minister's motto was heavy on forgiveness and starting a new chapter, which many felt was welcome, but also equally good number of people felt that that was exonerating TPLF from its crimes. The failure of TPLF to use even that opportunity due to arrogance and hubris shows you what kind of organization there are. But coming to what the Prime Minister and the Prosperity Party has been doing to correct the historical injustices and move the country into a new direction, I think you would understand that the role of, I can mention one from our perspective, from the peripheral perspective, Somalis and others. I think the system is now more inclusive in terms of decision making. The very formation of the Prosperity Party and the ideals under which it's supposed to work are a huge improvement on what was there. For instance, Somalis, Afaris, Benishangul, Gambelas, and almost 5 regions of the 9 regions that existed before were considered to be second-tier nationalities. That has been discarded. Those nationalities are now sitting on the table as equal partners, together with their other Ethiopian regions, the 4 EPRDF, what used to be called EPRF regions. That's a huge improvement. The peripheries are coming to the center in terms of voice, in terms of political representation and influence. That will enhance the unity of the country. A very inclusive and narrative and moderation is implemented by the Prime Minister, whereby today, apart from very extremist groups, the dominant narrative in the country is one of brotherhood, bringing people together, clamping down on the extreme ethnic hate that was propagated by TPLF. And I think that's bearing a lot of result in different parts of the country. As people, we always focus on what hasn't worked, but what hasn't worked, and therefore there are still issues to be corrected in some parts of the country where inter-community attacks are happening. But the bulk of the country is safe, and people are living together in harmony, in peace. The very Jijiga town, where on August 4, 9 Somalis were massacred, today is an example of tolerance and inclusivity. That's the same for other also areas in Oromia, in Amhara, in the south and all. So I think a huge amount of work has been done in highlighting what unites Ethiopians rather than what divides at the narrative level. In terms of the economy, a lot has changed, a lot of improvement we are seeing. And therefore, I think the reform is beset by a lot of challenges because of the nature of the 27 years, how the TPLF implemented its divisive politics in the last 27 years, but also because state building problems have existed for a long time in Ethiopia, and those are showing here and there. So overall, I think the reform team have done a very good job, and the corona pandemic, the delay of the elections, and a couple of other mishaps have happened. But once we now move into elections, into solidifying the gains made through the reform, I believe the defeat of the extremists like TPLF offers a new beginning to Ethiopia.
Mustafe, well, as you've said, there are lots of homeworks to be done in this country when it comes to the work of human rights and also, respecting the Constitution, bringing those people who've been suffering in different parts of the country together so that they can also contribute for the country's development under the ideology of state building, nation building, and also, focusing the country. There's fragmented attention of the people should also come back to this nucleus of forming one great Ethiopia. I think, as you've said, it has been, working. The Prime Minister Abiy's administration has been working a lot in this regard. Achievements can be seen everywhere. One achievement in peace, for instance, is his winning of the Nobel Peace Prize itself. It's one of the most important achievements, even for the continent of Africa. But we have to leave it there for now, Mustafe. Mustafe Muhammad, thank you so much for joining us here and explaining this important matter to our audience, and I appreciate the time that you've given us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Policy Matters.